Jason Riggs, and the name of my instrument is the Elastic Fantastic. It's this crazy two little objects that you put your arms inside of here. And it's actually just a wireless MIDI controller, so it's sending messages over a little Wi-Fi Arduino chip to my computer, which are mapped to any sequencer that you want. In this case, I have a bunch of parameters from Logic Pro and synthesizers and effects boxes and whatnot mapped to various motions that you do with this crazy little object here. And the way that it works is through this fundamental tension interaction. So you can see these two springs that are kind of at the core of the instrument. Makes this little accordion-like interaction here. And what's going on technically is that these little alligator clips right here on the left are attached to some stretchy cords which change, as they change their tension, they change their resistance, which is getting analog measured by this Arduino and piped back in MIDI format to the computer. And there's also, hidden on the inside of these two cylinders, are these Wiimotes, which are mapped to all sorts of different parameters, buttons, and the 3 different axes of the gyro and accelerometer, right? And so what's kind of going on is that when the instrument is twisted like this, there's a difference between the pitches and the 2 Wiimotes, and also a physical feedback motion between your body and the springs, right? So the fundamental idea behind this instrument was that I spent a lot of time in the music studio messing with various knobs and sliders and keys on keyboards, and I don't have a lot of physical feedback from the instruments that I use in the studio, and so I was curious if I took one part of my music production process. In this case, you just heard an example of some pad sounds that are kind of looping indefinitely, and instead of editing parameters manually for the pad sounds parameters, or maybe using a knob on a keyboard, having some kind of real physical feedback when I'm doing that. So that was kind of what inspired this whole project. Yeah, I guess things I learned, things that did work and things that didn't work. I would say where this project is at right now is that I just barely learned that this interaction does make sense from this prototype, but that it's not going to go much further with this existing prototype. I would have to revisit the hardware. I think one thing I learned that I wasn't expecting to learn is that when you're being really multidimensional with how many parameters you map to an instrument, it can get really hard to know what you're doing when you're playing it, because at any given point in your mind you're thinking, okay, I want to change this one sound right now, but in the motion of your arms you end up moving 4 of them, and it's kind of hard to keep track of what's going on. So I didn't really realize when I was in engineering mindset, I was like, oh, we can map all these different parameters, but then as I kind of forgot that as an actual instrument, it's not quite as intuitive if you don't get the result that you're expecting every time you do something. So I would probably fundamentally rethink the interaction in some ways to try to account for that. I would also consider taking part of what I learned from this, which is that tension is actually a really nice physical feedback mechanism. The springs are great, but that doesn't mean that you need to have both of your arms tied up. So one idea that I think would make a lot of sense is to make some sort of stationary, solid wall with springs attached to it with a handle, that you can do the same interaction that I just mentioned, but with one hand, and then you have your other hand free to play keys on a keyboard, for example, right? And I think that might actually be good for 2 different reasons. One is that you have another hand free, and the other reason is that it would probably be more easy to measure the tension accurately on a stationary object than between 2 objects. So those are some things I would probably play with next if I continue working on this.